In January 2001, North Carolina began releasing wild elk into the Cataloochee Valley, 52 of them over 2 seasons, into a southern Appalachian range that had not held a single elk in over 2 centuries. By 2022, scientists tracking those elk and their descendants through fecal DNA found something the original biologists had quietly stopped predicting. The herd was not just surviving, it was not just breeding, it was growing at a rate that, in the early years, the project team had openly admitted might never happen. Annual female growth rates were so high, they exceeded what most reintroduced elk populations in North America had ever produced. The animals were holding territory in valleys the park had never targeted, crossing onto Cherokee land, onto national forest, onto private farmland, and rebuilding a piece of southern Appalachian ecology that had been missing since before the United States existed as a country. The experimental release is officially over. What the herd is doing now is something biologists are still working to fully measure, and parts of it, they admit, surprised them. This is the full story, from the extinction that erased these animals, to the failed first years that nearly ended the project, to what 25 years of monitoring data is now revealing about how a single returned species can reshape a mountain valley. Most videos about elk reintroduction show you the bull bugling in the morning mist and call it a happy ending. This one follows the science 25 years deep, into the calf deaths, the bear conflicts, the state import ban that blocked the third release, the parasites, the roadkill, and the peer-reviewed evidence that is only now emerging about how this herd survived against the early projections. Every claim in this video is sourced from the National Park Service, the United States Geological Survey, peer-reviewed research in the Journal of Wildlife Management, and a 2023 University of Tennessee dissertation built on 3 field seasons of fecal DNA collection. This is not guesswork. This is what 25 years of monitoring records actually show. But before you can understand what these elk are doing now, you need to understand what the southern Appalachians lost when they disappeared, and why bringing them back required 18 years of planning before a single animal was ever released. The American elk is not a deer with antlers. It is the second largest member of the deer family on Earth. An adult bull can weigh up to 900 pounds. A cow can reach 600. From nose to tail, an adult animal stretches 7 to 10 feet in length and stands nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder. Its antlers grow each spring, fed through a soft layer of velvet that delivers calcium and minerals directly into the bone, and by August, those antlers can reach 55 to 60 inches in length, span almost 5 feet wide, and weigh 30 pounds for the pair. During the autumn rut, a dominant bull will gather a harem of up to 20 cows, and his bugling call, high, piercing, and absolutely unmistakable, can carry over a mile through forested mountains. But here is what makes elk irreplaceable in the southern Appalachians. They are not just grazers, and they are not just browsers. They are both. They eat grasses and forbs in open fields. They eat acorns in the fall. They strip bark, leaves, and buds from shrubs and saplings in the forest understory. This makes elk something more than a large herbivore. They are an ecological link between the open meadows of the high country and the closed canopy of the cove hardwood forests, moving nutrients, opening light gaps, and shaping the seed pressure on dozens of plant species simultaneously. Later in this video, you will see what happens when that link is restored to a landscape that has been running without it for that long. The data is not what the early skeptics expected. But first, how the southern Appalachians lost these animals in the first place. When you remove an animal like the elk for that long, you do not just lose a species, you lose a relationship between species. And the southern Appalachians lost that relationship to the most aggressive force in 19th century North America: unregulated market hunting. Beginning in the late 1700s, as European settlement pushed into the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, elk were hunted for meat, for hide, for tallow, and for the simple fact that no law protected them. There were no seasons, there were no bag limits, there were no licenses. The last elk in North Carolina is believed to have been killed by the late 1700s. The last recorded elk in Tennessee was shot in 1849. By 1900, the entire North American elk population had been pushed so close to collapse that hunting groups and conservationists openly worried the species would not survive at all. The eastern subspecies, the population that had lived in the Appalachians for thousands of years, was already gone. After 1849 in this region, silence. What the National Park Service did next would take a full decade of planning, cost $1.5 million, and depend on a Canadian park 2,000 miles away. And the first 5 years almost ended the project. The work began long before the first animal arrived. A 1991 habitat study. A 1996 University of Tennessee feasibility assessment. A formal environmental assessment published in June 2000. Only then, in January 2001, did the first elk roll into Cataloochee. The science behind the release was as careful as the planning. The first 25 elk arrived from land between the lakes, a federal recreation area on the Tennessee and Kentucky border where a captive elk population had been monitored for disease for decades. They were held in an acclimation pen, screened for brucellosis, bovine tuberculosis, and chronic wasting disease, 3 of the most feared cervid diseases in North America, and were only released into the open valley after testing came back clean. The second group of 27 elk, released in 2002, came from Elk Island National Park near Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, a population that had been isolated from other elk and other deer for so long that it had never tested positive for chronic wasting disease in its entire monitoring history. Cataloochee itself was chosen for a specific reason. It had open historical farmland, mixed hardwood forest, abundant water, and almost no through traffic. It was the closest thing to elk habitat the park could offer. Every single released animal was radio-collared. Every newborn calf would be collared. Every elk that died for any reason would be necropsied. The entire $1.5 million project was funded by private conservation groups, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Friends of the Smokies, and the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Not a dollar of special federal funding was directed to the program, and then the project started failing. By 2005, the originally planned 5-year experimental window had closed, and the total elk population was estimated at roughly the same number that had been released. 52 animals in, 52 animals on the ground. The reason was brutal and specific. Black bear predation on calves was running at around 50%. Of the calves that did survive, more than 3 out of every 4 were male, a sex ratio that would cripple any chance of future growth, because elk recovery depends entirely on cows producing more cows. Biologists were openly concerned. A single disease outbreak, a hard winter, or a poaching incident in the wrong place could collapse the entire reintroduction. The original plan had called for 3 releases totaling 75 to 90 animals. Only 2 had happened. The third was blocked by a North Carolina state moratorium on importing deer and elk into the state, imposed because of disease transmission fears. The park applied for a waiver. The waiver did not come. So the project did something different. It changed the predators. In preparation for the 2006 calving season, park wildlife managers began a black bear relocation program, moving bears out of Cataloochee and into other areas of the park to give elk calves time to grow large enough to defend themselves. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission strongly recommended it. The North Carolina Bear Hunters Association raised objections, and the park sat down with them to explain the reasoning. The relocations went forward. The 2006 results were the turning point. Of 12 calves born that year, 10 survived. In 2007, 11 of 17 made it. The elk population over a year old rose to roughly 75. Researchers later concluded that 2 things had driven the change. Bear relocation had reduced calf predation pressure, and the elk cows themselves had begun learning how to defend their young. Inexperienced first-time mothers had been hiding their calves in places bears could find. Experienced mothers chose differently. The animals were teaching themselves how to live in the southern Appalachians again. Knowledge that had been lost for 200 years was being rebuilt, in real time, calving season, by the cows themselves. By the time the experimental phase closed in 2008, the population had crossed the threshold. In 2010, the park published a new environmental assessment proposing a permanent management plan. The estimate was around 140 elk. The research findings were unambiguous on 3 points. The population was sustainable, the elk had only limited negative impacts on park vegetation, and human-elk conflict was minimal. In October 2011, National Park Service Regional Director David Vela signed the finding of no significant impact. The elk in the Smokies were no longer an experiment. They were a permanent native species restored to their southern Appalachian range. And then the herd did something nobody had been confident enough to predict. It exploded. A study published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 2025, based on 3 winters of fecal DNA collection across western North Carolina, produced the first rigorous population estimates the program had ever generated. Combined males and females totaled 179 elk in 2020, 220 in 2021, and 240 in 2022. The annual female growth rate during the first year of the study reached 1.559, meaning the cows of western North Carolina increased their own numbers by more than 50% in a single year. That is not a recovering population. That is a population taking its country back. By the time the National Park Service updated its figures, roughly 270 elk roamed western North Carolina, with about 150 of them moving in and out of the park across the seasons. From this point forward, the elk of the southern Appalachians are managed but not assembled. No more imports, no more acclimation pens, no more crates being unloaded at Cataloochee. The herd is now doing on its own what the project spent 18 years trying to make possible. And that is where the story becomes extraordinary. Because what the data is showing is not just a population that recovered, it is a population that is rebuilding something the southern Appalachians have not had in living memory. The first change was geographic. The elk were released in a single valley. They are now anchored across 3 distinct centers: Cataloochee in the northeast, Balsam Mountain in the high country, and Oconaluftee at the southern entrance to the park, where elk now graze on the visitor center lawn so reliably that the National Park Service prints viewing guidance for new arrivals. Beyond those 3 centers, the herd has flowed outward, across the Qualla boundary, the sovereign homeland of the eastern band of Cherokee Indians, onto national forest land, into private valleys, and into watersheds that no biologist marked on a release map. Individual bulls have ranged 30 miles from Cataloochee and returned. The fecal DNA work shows the herd concentrating exactly where elk are supposed to concentrate, on the edges between open meadow and standing forest, the exact landscape elk evolved in. The animals are choosing the country, and the country is holding them. The second change was ecological. For longer than the country has existed, the southern Appalachians ran without a large native grazer in their open valleys. Forests grew, meadows closed in, plant communities adjusted, and the entire ecological process of a 1,000-pound animal moving between forest and field, distributing nutrients, opening light gaps, pruning saplings, scattering seeds in its winter coat, simply stopped. Now it has started again. The 2010 environmental assessment found early impacts on park vegetation were limited because the herd was still small. With the population now nearly double that, vegetation monitoring continues, and the elk are functioning the way native large grazers are supposed to function in this landscape, moderately, gradually, and across a much wider area than the park alone. The herd is doing in the southern Appalachians what bison do in the Great Plains and what red deer do in the Scottish Highlands. It is restoring a process, not a postcard, a process. The third change was human, and this one is the deepest. The science behind the recovery is no longer being produced by one agency. The 2025 Journal of Wildlife Management study lists co-authors from the United States Geological Survey, the University of Tennessee, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, the National Park Service, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The tribal biologist's name appears on the paper alongside the federal scientists. The herd that crosses the koala boundary every autumn is being studied jointly by the federal park and the sovereign nation whose ancestors hunted these same valleys for thousands of years before the elk disappeared. The Cherokee name for the river valley that holds the southern park entrance, Equanulty, the place by the river, survived this entire absence without the animals that had once moved through it. That name is now back in the same landscape as a living elk herd. Not a memory of one, a real one. Cows, calves, bulls, antlers in velvet. The bugle in October that no one alive in 1900 had heard in these mountains, and that no one alive today can avoid hearing in the autumn rut. That sound is back. After more than a century and a half of silence, the bugle of a bull elk now carries across Cataloochee every fall, and across Balsam, and across Oconaluftee, and across the koala boundary, and out into the national forest beyond. The mountains remember it. They have started to answer. 52 animals, 2 batches, 1 Canadian park, 1 Kentucky source population. A decade of planning, 5 years of near failure, 2 decades of growth, and a herd that has now multiplied more than 5-fold from the number that was released. A federal park, a private foundation, a state university, a federally recognized tribe, and a southern Appalachian range that is no longer running without its largest native grazer. The elk are home. But North Carolina is not the only place where a returned grazer is rewriting a landscape that had given up on it. In our next video, we go to a place where an animal far larger than an elk, an animal that once moved across an entire continent in herds of millions, was brought back to a single valley, and within a decade had begun changing the grassland in ways the project leaders had openly hoped for but had not dared to promise. If you thought a 1,000-pound bull elk could shape a mountain valley, wait until you see what a 2,000-pound prairie animal can do to a grassland that has been waiting for it for 150 years. You will never look at an empty meadow the same way again.